Welcome back to the ThermoDiet podcast. Today we've got a very special episode for you all where we are joined by the Modern Meathead, Ben Yanes. How you doing today, Ben?
I'm excellent, Tyler, and I commend you for the correct pronunciation of my last name. That's in terms of podcasts I've done, I would say it's about 5% success rate. So we're off to a good start.
Yeah, I was practicing last night in the mirror. Yanes. No,
Yeah,
it was funny
excellent.
when you called out Connor in that the first seminar back in New York. He's like, Connor, my name is actually Yanes.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because it's kind of my fault to some degree when I know people for longer periods of time and I don't say anything and then I address it more publicly. It's kind of embarrassing move, but yeah, kudos to you, I guess.
I think it's kind of funny, but it is funny how everyone just assumes it's Yanes. You need like a little accent on the end or something, like Yanes.
I mean, listen, man, these are just the cards I've been dealt. So
awesome. So you graduated from Springfield, right, with a degree in public health?
No, that was not me.
Oh, Gettysburg. Sorry,
Gettysburg. Yeah, Gettysburg. Gettysburg College, very tiny college in rural Pennsylvania.
Yep.
Degree was in health sciences, which is really you can kind of do whatever you want with a health science degree as far as they're concerned. Like I would say I went more down the exercise phys rabbit hole, exercise science rabbit hole, if you want to call it that. But they just broadly call it health science. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. And then you dove a lot into some rehab and some biomechanics stuff. Do you want to just talk about that for the listener real quick?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say it was sort of mostly intertwined with the second half of my college experience in terms of just like I'll say sophomore year, I really started digging into a lot of the biomechanics anatomy stuff just because it was, in some ways related to the courses that I was taking, right? Like I took A&P like everyone sort of had to. I took basic physics. You had to retake bio, chem, all that crap. And so it was kind of just like nice to start to get into that stuff in tandem, but also sort of separately from my courses, because a lot of the coursework that I was doing was, very sort of I want to say useful in terms of a starting place, but not really at all in terms of the application based stuff. So, I initially really wanted to dig into the biomechanics anatomy stuff just to sort of help myself in my own sort of lifting journey, because that's when I stopped playing sports, which I played my whole life. The sort of issues that me and my friends were running into from a pain perspective, I found difficult to solve without some degree of knowledge in that area. So, we can talk, I guess, more specifically about the kinds of things that I was looking into, but I definitely started more on the rehab-based side, like you mentioned, specifically because of, the fact that I was doing more barbell lifts and my friends, were lifting for their football team or their lacrosse team, and they were forced to do, the 185 or 225 max bench test, and their shoulders were ouchy from all the lifting they were doing. So that's kind of where I started for those reasons. Yeah.
So we actually we have a pretty similar background. I was a bio major at school, kind of went through the whole lifting thing. Basically got hurt a lot as well. Because I was an athlete, because had horrible coordination and technique usually. But then I kind of drove into like the hypertrophy stuff. So my first question for you was, I've been following you for a while, and I was curious what in your head drove the change from looking at more of the PRI rehab stuff to the biomechanics. And not just like, I feel like it's worthwhile to look into everything, but what changed your mind in terms of like that you wanted to be I guess you're considered like the modern meathead kind of thing, more so biomechanics. What drove that change?
I've done a lot of thinking about this because it was, in some ways, it was a seamless transition for me. Like it just felt like a very natural progression of things in a weird way. Not that like a ton of people go through it. Mm-hmm. But what I found was that mainly when I was looking into all the rehab-based stuff, which for those of you who don't know what PRI is, it's basically like a rehab-based model that is really, really focused on a lot of different breathing techniques, positional drills, things that are supposed to sort of quote unquote, recenter you, at specific joints and in specific ways. And, that was a model that worked really, really well for powerlifters because powerlifters are these athletes that are just constantly hurting themselves. And so, the bare minimum activity, in certain tissues that are either, really abused in powerlifting or never used in a highly specific way. The bare minimum sort of dose to those muscles or sort of pulling away from a dose of those muscles are things that actually allow people to like experience tremendous amounts of relief. So, you go from like doing 5 sets of low bar back squats and you feel like your shoulders are destroyed, go over to the corner, do some 90-90 breathing, and like you feel brand new kind of a thing. And so that worked really, really well for powerlifters, especially, intermediates, beginners who weren't as well trained and weren't as strong. But what I started to realize is for the people that were more advanced that I was working with, and for me, just in my own training, not that I was a particularly advanced person, but I like you, just genetically wasn't blessed to just never be injured all the time. And so, I would have a tweaked pec on this week. I would have a strained adductor on the next week. It was just like constant like workarounds in my training. And so I was like, this can't be the answer. Like I'm doing all this rehab-based stuff on the side. I'm doing it pre-workout. I'm doing it post-workout. What the fuck is going on? And so then I started looking deeper into, and keep in mind, all this stuff to me is biomechanics, like to some degree, like it's all, we're still looking at the same system. It may be a different model that we're looking through, but I was able to sort of transition, I think, maybe more easily than people who would just sort of jump right into the hypertrophy stuff, because I went really, really, really deep down the anatomy biomechanics rabbit hole before I sort of moved over. So what I started to realize is that all of the hypertrophy based principles in terms of, paths of motion and fiber directions, all that crap was the same. It was just, the way that I thought about it was like, oh, this is actually just in principle, all these things are very similar from all the rehab-based principles, but you're just applying them to a higher, stress degree. Like you're just applying them to an organism that needs to deal with more stress to be able to create these changes that you're looking for. So, where on one end of the spectrum, it was like, oh, this 90-90 hip lift was doing this thing for this person. Now, instead of just doing a reach to get my shoulder blades moving, now I'm going to do a motion that's loaded across my body. So it's very similar in some ways, but the transition was made because I couldn't get past certain roadblocks with either clients that were stronger or more hypertrophied. And just even in myself, I couldn't figure out how to actually make the rehab stuff work in tandem with all the volume and powerlifting that I was doing. So the solution to that was to scale up the stress in a more specific way rather than to just sort of downgrade the volume of the activities that I was already doing.
Yeah. I would also say in some ways you would be like decreasing the stress because you're more the specificity is also almost decreasing the stress because you're taking it off certain joints and other things by putting it on the muscle. It's almost like reapportioning the stress.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that confuses a lot of people too, because what they'll do is like a lot of powerlifters I see do this, they'll go from doing low bar back squats to doing front squats. Right. And they're like, oh man, front squats are magical. Like, I don't know what happened, but like my low bar squat, my numbers are just like skyrocketing. And I'm like, well, you just took like half of the stress that you were experiencing in your upper and lower halves, and you just dropped the load by like, 60%. Yeah. And, now you're able to actually express that. But that's a good point.
It is really weird. Like, cause I'm assuming you came in the same way where it's like, you just view all these exercises almost as like these different magical creatures. Like, oh yeah, I switched to front squats versus back squats versus just seeing like the different biomechanics and the joint loading where it's like, oh, this is just like a gradient versus like, these are completely separate magical entities.
The names, like naming exercises, is a very necessary but terrible thing. Like exercises having names is unfortunate, because if everyone just understood exercise as, I'm loading these joints in this specific vector at this specific distance, then we would all be able to make much better decisions, But now we see front squat, we see back squat, we see RDL, what even is an RDL? If I told you to do an RDL and I told 10 other people to do an RDL, it may look 10 different ways, right? So
So do you think in your personal journey, you could ever see yourself going back to more of a PRI style training for yourself, or maybe for some clients that don't really care about bodybuilding?
So that's the thing is, and here's the thing that I think distinguishes the sort of two realms. We'll call it the hypertrophy bodybuilding based realm, and then the more rehab based models. The more, and let me know if this makes sense, because I don't even, thoughts are a little jumbled in my head.
You're good.
The bodybuilding hypertrophy style stuff has worked in every rehab client I've ever had, which is super lucky to some degree. Like the population that I get is probably like, fucked up, but not fucked up enough to actually require like a higher level of rehab. Right. So the bodybuilding rehab stuff, hypertrophy stuff has worked for every rehab client I've ever had, but the rehab stuff has never worked for a more advanced bodybuilding client I've ever had.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So so all the things that maybe worked for the Gen Pop person who just had a shoulder ouchie, like 99% of the time, it's just an adjustment in where they're holding the dumbbell, where they're holding, the trap bar, right? Those kinds of things. But in people who maybe are more chronic pain based, it's like, okay, instead of looking at it from the lens of, I'm going to do these breathing drills to put air in these positions to activate these muscles, I'm just going to look at the joint and how it's moving. And I'm going to try to load it in a direction that I think is appropriate for the person. And like I said, like 9 times out of 10, it ends up working out well.
Do you still use any of the breathing techniques at all, or like try and teach people to exhale? Because I do think that's an underrated aspect just in kind of cross life. I do jiu-jitsu in the morning sometimes, and I just like notice it from that PRI lens. It's like everyone's just so focused on the inhale and no one even thinks about the exhale.
So I will 100% utilize the principles when I'm looking at things like, for example, like oblique training is an area where I think that would be hyper relevant, right? So getting people to be able to actually find and connect with their obliques, which is actually very, very important for, bodybuilding and like posing and those kinds of things. So you get a lot of bodybuilders actually, I think that, have a great like sort of 6-pack rectus area. And then you look at their obliques and it's like, there's no sort of distinction between the divisions of the external oblique, the internal oblique, those kinds of things. And obviously that will come down to a degree to like the level of leanness of the person, but teaching those people to exhale can actually be super helpful. It's just very difficult to do outside the context of their posing specifically because they have so much tissue and it's very hard for them not to breathe. But I would say in those specific more ab-based contexts, I use them a lot. But in terms of a lifting-based context, if I don't have to add any unnecessary cueing, like if I don't have to say, okay, we're going to get this long exhale for you to set your brace. If the brace is just set up properly based on where I put things, then I'm not going to, the fewer cues, the better, like in my estimation. So mainly just with the ab stuff, though, to answer the question directly.
Okay, so that's cool. Let's dive into like the meat and potatoes of the podcast, if you're cool with that.
Yeah.
All right, Ben. So what drives muscle growth?
Well, I think if there were a clear answer, if there were one answer to this, like we would all look like Ronnie Coleman. Maybe not Ronnie, but nothing. So I think that when people ask this, because I know that sort of the layers that the question holds, but I think when most people ask this question, they assume that there is like one answer, like, oh, it's this thing, or oh, it's that thing. From like a mechanistic standpoint, what we all seem to be sort of on board with is this idea of like mechanical tension, which is just like mechanical tension as a phrase. I'm starting to get angry at. Like I think we should just say tension, or we should just say like pulling force. Like okay, we all sort of understand what we mean. Let's just like say the simple version. And there may be some nuances in terms of like how tension is different from mechanical tension and so on. But I think for most people's understanding, mechanical tension is just a pulling force that a muscle exerts in response to having to actually either prevent or create motion, right? And effectively enough volume of that pulling force with enough time, proper nutrition, proper sleep, proper drugs, if you're a pro bodybuilder, right? All those things sort of layered on top of one another is what drives muscle growth. And I think the sort of N1 principles where they lay out principles of thresholds is really, really important here. So for those of you that don't know the idea of the principle of thresholds, it's like we have all these different categories, the ones I sort of just listed, and we need to have a sufficient amount of stimulus in sort of every one of the buckets. So, stimulus in relationship to sleep would just be time you're sleeping, quality that you're sleeping, in terms of nutrition, obviously quality of food, quantity, macro distribution, all that stuff. Obviously as a subcategory of that, you would have your supplements, your things that play more of a minor role. You could make sunlight a category. Hell, people love sunlight now. People love to talk about sunlight. Right. So all those different buckets are things that we need to sort of have like a minimum threshold dose of. And if any single one of those buckets is not sufficiently filled, then we have this multiply by zero effect where the whole sort of equation just like falls to crap because we're not actually, filling one of those important buckets. So, if you asked on a very specific level, like what is the mechanism? Well, the mechanism seems to be this tension related thing, right? Which creates some degree of deformation, which creates some degree of like signaling cascade that we don't really understand, right? But at a more broad applicable level, it's like you need enough of all of these things that we already know are really important. And then you need enough effort and volume in the weight room specific to the tissues that you want to grow. So that would be my sort of broad scopes answer. And there are some other things that I'm sure your listeners are into, like mechanisms related to, metabolic fatigue and mechanical damage and those kinds of things. But I think those are like really, really in the weeds stuff that I personally am super interested in, but I just stay away from because it's not really my wheelhouse in terms of describing these things. I take a more broad scopes approach, just like nutrition, as I'm sure we'll get into.
I think I was listening to Jeff Nippard yesterday. He actually posted a video for the first time in a while. And one of the research articles that he cited, they said that nutrition permits muscle growth, which I don't inherently agree with fully, but I do think it is a good way of picturing it. It's like we know there are like nutrient, like you can influence testosterone levels via nutrition, other things with nutrient partitioning. But at the end of the day, it's like huge majority of it is from the gym, what the resistance training you're doing in the gym. And I think that's very much along with what you said with sleep and all these things. Like if you don't have your big buckets in order, you're not going to get muscle growth, even if you're killing it in the gym.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that people see things happen like plateaus, and they assume that the plateau wasn't always going to be there when it arrived. From the standpoint of like, maybe someone who's really, really genetically gifted lifts and lifts and lifts, and you see this all the time, like especially in college settings, like people's sleep sucks, their nutrition sucks, their behavioral habits suck. Like they go out and drink 5 nights a week, and like they still make tons of progress just because they're training their asses off in the weight room, and eventually there's this plateau happening where people are like, oh, I was doing all these things before and I just kept doing them. Like, why did they stop working? It's like, well, they were always going to stop working for you at a certain point because you didn't have these other things filled. It just hadn't become apparent to you, because of whatever, timeline you sort of ran dry.
Yeah, that is a good way of looking at it. Like kind of, you just depleted the last bucket. That drop is empty.
Yeah, exactly.
So in your eyes, what is the difference for training for size versus strength?
Yeah, I love this conversation actually, because it kind of really goes against, I think, what most people think strength is or whatnot. The difference I would say is mainly just in how you conceptualize it. Honestly, like it's not even in the actual training. It's in the ways that you conceptualize the two words, right? So muscle growth is like, that's okay. That's obvious. We understand what that means. But strength is like this sort of nebulous, like, what does strength mean? When you talk to 10 different people who specialize in this stuff, oftentimes you'll get like 5 different answers across those 10 people. So for me personally, strength is just the output of a skill, right? It's like, okay, I have a certain level of strength in my barbell squat and in my barbell deadlift and my barbell bench press, right? But I also have a certain amount of that output in a lat pull down, right? So like the strength of my lat pull down is the strength of my lat pull down. The strength of my lat pull down has nothing to do directly with the strength of my barbell squat, right? Despite maybe what some people will say about those two things. But in terms of like muscle size, muscle growth, in the let's say I'm doing like sets of 8 to 12, and I'm doing the lat pull down, whatever variant, and over the course of a 12-week mesocycle, my lat pull down goes from 100 pounds for 8 reps to 150 pounds for 12 reps. Like that's a very possible thing, especially if it's a new exercise, right? I improve the strength of that of my skill in the lat pull down, right? I improve the output that I was able to generate, but that's specific to the lat pull down. Specifically in relationship to obviously your skill in the exercise. So like, did you improve the physical motor pattern? Did you grease the groove, right? So to speak. But in that case, it's like you improve your strength, but it's also likely that had all these other things been in check, all the things we just discussed, that you also would have improved the size of, any of the extensor muscles, right? Or maybe, some of the elbow flexors. So there seems to be this like, generalized opinion that strength and size are inherently two very different things. But because strength is specific to not only skill, but also like rep ranges within that skill, I would say that both of them are closely related for 99.9% of people, especially the people that are trying to gain hypertrophy, right? Now, this is a different conversation than saying, oh, well, then I should just like do sets of 2 to 3 since strength and hypertrophy are the same. It's like, well, no, we run into some practical limitations when that happens to be the case. But I think for a majority of people, who are just trying to get bigger, it's like you have your strength within all these different rep ranges. And if you can improve your strength in the rep ranges, it's possible that you also gain size. But whether you look at it as strength or just improvement in the skill, I think is irrelevant. So when we're talking about, something like powerlifting, we think obviously, oh, this is a strength sport. Weightlifting is a strength sport. And it is, like, that's what we call it. But the strength is ultimately specific to the skills. And it also doesn't mean that there's going to be no muscle growth if you improve your strength in the big 3 lifts. So I just think that the distinction is more in the way that you conceptualize it and the specific scenarios that you're looking at under that sort of more broad scope viewpoint, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Have you seen that study where they looked at the powerlifters and the highest predictor, I think like the 95th percentile was of who was going to win and score the most in the powerlifting competition was how much muscle mass they had before?
Oh, I haven't seen that. Yeah. That makes sense to some degree.
Yeah. So there is a slight, in my opinion, there is a slight difference between like the neurological aspect of strength, like in terms of like force output, which is largely what you said, like the skill of contracting certain things and all of that fun stuff. But largely it's force driven and same thing with hypertrophy. Like, and that's why I think generally one of my thought processes recently since starting coaching is like, I think you should probably try to always keep the rep range as low as possible, like after like 5+, in my opinion. And that's largely because I think if you prescribe someone 6 rep max, or like, let's say 6 to 8 reps, and they really had, I don't know, 9 in them, or let's say like they stop one short. So they had 8 in them, they stop at 7. They're going to get like 89% of the way there versus if you stop at 11, I feel like they're much more likely to stop earlier at a higher rep range. So like the difference in failure between a 6 rep versus a 12 rep can be like, there's a huge difference in reps, if that makes sense. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's one of those sort of things that falls under the practical considerations category, where we can talk about all the really cool, interesting theoretical underpinnings of this stuff. But in application, it's much like, I've heard people recently say that, load is not a huge concern or driver of orthopedic issues. And that's just like, you just never actually see, like in theory, it's like, okay, well, if someone is executing everything with perfect tempo, control, load progression, volume, all of this other crap, then yeah, like maybe that would make sense. But you just never see, like, load is always a thing that breaks people. It's never like, like look at the way that Jay Cutler trained. Jay Cutler did 1,000 sets and none of them were even remotely close to actually being at failure. And yet, he's however many time Mr. Olympia, not to use him as he's kind of an exception in some ways, but just the general point being that like it is very nice to think that like my client who's been training for 2 months can do an appropriate set to 12 at failure. But it's like, you're absolutely right in that, it's highly likely they get more out of every set, given that they're probably going to steer farther away from failure if they're using higher loads. The issue that you may run into with that, depending on the person's training experience, is their technique all of a sudden may go to shit because now they're scared of using an 8 rep max as opposed to a 15 rep max. So I think there's a middle ground to be had there, which is kind of what we talk about with the whole coach's eye thing. But that's much easier to manipulate and determine when you're working with someone in person as opposed to online. That's kind of one of the roadblocks I've run into, at least in the online setting.
Definitely makes sense. Yeah, and that's a good point as well. Speaking of the role of volume in hypertrophy, how do you view the role of volume in hypertrophy? And so why not just do, I guess it's a little different for, let's say you're training a client in person or yourself. Why not just do one hard set to absolute failure and call it quits? What do you think drives the usefulness of volume in hypertrophy?
It's a good question, right? Because you can use all these variables in a ton of different ways. It also doesn't need to be specific to, it also doesn't need to be completely generalized, right? So, like, for example, and I'll probably bring this up at several other points because he has a lot of application to these discussions. But my training partner is a pro bodybuilder, and certain muscle groups, training them is much more. I don't want to say. I'll just say risky than others. Like training his biceps is a lot less, but has a much lower likelihood of getting him injured than training his glutes or training his quads, right? The things where the absolute loads are just like so significantly magnified, especially because he's had, spinal issues in the past. But in relationship to the question, what I would say is that volume is a tool and load / intensity / effort is another tool. And those two things always need to be discussed within the context of each other, right? So you can take the approach of doing one single set that is, incredibly taxing. Maybe it's a super, like I see a lot of bodybuilders now doing, like, they call it one set. Like when I trained with Nick Goff in person, he was like, all right, we're going to do like one set of pendulum squats. And then he's like, yeah, so what I want you to do is fail between the 15 and 20 rep range. And then we're going to do 3 clusters. And I need you to get to a total of the same number of reps that you hit in the first set over the course of the next 3 clusters. And if you don't get it in 3, like you better get it in, 4 or 5. Right. So that was one set. So ultimately, to some degree, you could be like, well, what is a set? Like, what do I consider a set? And then we sort of get trapped in this loophole of like, well, now we just get stuck on definitions and now nothing productive comes out of the discussion. So from my perspective, I think volume is something that you should toggle based on your relationship with the specific muscle group. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know what your relationship with the specific muscle group is or the specific pattern is, then you should go with the most generalized recommendations that have worked for a very long period of time for a majority of people. Even with the limited amount of research that we have, especially in more advanced people, if you're someone who's just getting into this stuff, like go with the very generalized recommendations. And then based on every single muscle group and your relationship to those exercises and the progressions and how you see your progress happening, then you start to make toggles based off of that. Right. So start at sort of a middle point and then toggle it up or down based on whether you maybe you just can't stand high intensity work, for your quads. So use higher reps and use lower loads. You may find that using higher reps and using lower loads allows you to do more volume. You may actually find that it does the opposite. Like I've just seen so many inconsistencies person to person and muscle group to muscle group in myself that it's impossible for me to make a generalized recommendation. But ultimately, if again, I were to come back to actually answer the specific question, I would say that volume is just a tool, and it's a tool that's based on all of those sort of aforementioned factors and probably more factors that I'm not immediately thinking of right now.
Yeah. So theoretically, let's talk about maybe not practically used in the gym. How would you view the volume? So let's say we can do this. There's no limits and we can just do this one set to absolute failure. And, the way I describe mechanical tension is basically just to basically trying to use a load to achieve a fatigue point in the muscle. So it has to recruit its high threshold motor units. And basically it's kind of, getting to the point of close to failure or to failure. How would you mechanistically view, and if you could disagree with that, also feel free to give your opinion, but how would you view the addition to, like, let's say we go to this absolute failure. We can't, we have a perfect resistance profile. There's no more mechanical tension that can be produced. What is the point of, like, how would you theorize that, like, volume would add more to that doing another set if let's say you can recover from that?
So let's take two examples, right? Mm-hmm. In theory, we'll take two examples or the two hypothetical people. One is like an absolute beginner, right? And one is, someone competing at the Olympia. Mm-hmm. The way that I like to conceptualize it is that the much more advanced people become much more fatigue resistant, right? Like, this is how all adaptations tend to work, at least in like a very broad scope, non-specific sense. And hypertrophy is included in that, right? So if we take the beginner and we do a set to absolute failure, name any muscle group, that one set to failure, assuming it's actual failure, which it probably couldn't be, like if they're a beginner, right? But let's just assume that in theory it could be. That's probably like the most amount of stimulus, not only that they've ever had, but that they'll probably need for, I don't know, probably a week, right? It's like, you see this oftentimes happen in like a deload phases where people are maintaining muscle. I almost look at the beginner as like the person who's just trying to maintain muscle in terms of volume landmarks. Like, you need to do so little volume to achieve some threshold of stimulus. So in the beginner, I would say, like, yeah, you do that one set, you're good. You probably, they're so fatigue non-resistant, if that's a word or a phrase to use, that the smallest dose creates this magnitude of effect that is completely disproportionate to the dose, right? But the opposite holds true for the pro bodybuilder who maybe does one set and it's like, they wake up tomorrow, they're like, did I even do anything? I haven't really seen many examples, and obviously, pharmacology will play a role in this to some degree. I haven't seen many examples of really advanced people doing one set and making a ton of progress, doing one set of an exercise in a workout where they have 2 or 3 days to recover, right? And so, you look at someone like Dorian Yates, for example. A lot of people talk about Dorian Yates when they're talking about these higher intensity, like single set to failure things. And it's like, yeah, well, when you look at the actual training, it's like, is it a set? Like, is it a set, or is it like this, mega set of doom that's taken to like 5 different degrees of failure, where it's like, you can't even sit down on the toilet, after you're done. So again, what we're calling a set actually is obviously very important. But if we assume that a set is actually a set, I've never seen a more advanced trainee do a single set and get a ton out of that from the perspective of like a long-term, progression from a long-term progression standpoint. So what I view as, more contextually appropriate to the more advanced person is the dose response is, again, almost flip-flop from the beginner, from maybe the early intermediate, where the beginner, early intermediate it gives themselves a small dose and they get this massive response, and where the pro bodybuilder actually gives this massive dose and the response proportionately is exponentially lower, right? And so the amount of fatigue that they are capable of generating is very, very high, right? Which is potentially one argument in the opposite direction, but how they deal with that fatigue is incredibly different from the beginner, from the intermediate, where they're able to deal with the fatigue in an incredibly efficient way. And so whether or not that would be enough, I would say is really an impossible question to answer outside of just looking at the individual. And even if you do look at the individual and you're like, was this enough? You won't know until you're, 16 weeks, out and you're measuring diameters and you're measuring skin folds and you're measuring body weight and you're measuring all that stuff, right? We don't even have an appropriately accurate proxy for measuring this stuff. So answering the question of is it enough is much more of a retrospective thing. It's like, I got down to stage weight and I'm 10 pounds heavier and more muscular. That was probably enough, or at least the accumulation of those things was enough. So I don't know if I answered that.
No, I don't know if the question could be answered. I think you answered it in the best way possible.
Okay. Cool, sick.
The context definitely makes a lot of sense. And a lot of times I think there's just so many unknowns that we have to kind of just manage and use to utilize and like kind of just go off what we do know in terms of the research, I guess.
But that's also how you know that, like, and I'm sure I've been guilty of this too, where I will say, and like I look back on some of my, my older posts and I cringe, and I think that's part of the process. But just when you're so certain about anything, you feel like, oh man, I really got a good understanding of this thing. And then like, lo and behold, the following week or the following day, it'll be like, oh, there was this new thing that I didn't know before. Oh, I guess I don't know that much about that thing that I thought I knew a lot about. And that process just repeats just in this never ending cycle where it's like you get to a point where you're like, oh, I feel pretty good about this. I'm feeling competent. New bit of information. Okay, now I feel incompetent. Now I have to do more to feel competent again. New bit of information. So it's like, it's a fantastic loop to be in some ways, but it's also a torturous one in others.
Yeah. No, I completely feel you on that one. It is interesting. I have a lot of respect for the people, and I think it is just kind of a maturity thing. Me being the most mature, the ability to like say you're wrong, and like the ability to also like, in real time, like be open to new ideas and say, like, and also say like, like you said before, like this isn't my cup of tea. Like we can talk about this, but it's not my particular wheelhouse. It takes a lot of maturity, I would say.
I think so too. And I think that it's something that actually ends up making you feel more confident, right? Because if we're doing this podcast and you're like, Ben, please explain, the signaling cascade that you referred to, on a physiological level in terms of like the deformation and what will create mechanical, from mechanical tension hypertrophy, I'd be like, I have no idea. And I won't try to describe that. And that makes me feel better about staying within the things that I feel at least semi-competent describing, because if I'm talking about those things, I know that I'm delivering something that's potentially valuable to people. Whereas if I'm just speaking out of my ass and I'm talking about all these things that I sort of maybe have a vague understanding of, I'm not really helping anyone doing that. So I'm actually helping myself by not, talking about those things.
Yeah. I will say though, I do like to take I don't want to go into the signaling cascade because I would probably just put everyone to sleep, including probably you and I. But it is fun to like have people like that are an expert, let's say, and feel like this and ask them some sort of a speculative question as to where they will see something going, where they would take their guess. I think that's a lot of fun.
Yes, agreed.
Cool. So I would like to hear your thoughts on viewing lifting as a skill. I think Nikolov is probably or Joe Bennett and that kind of realm, like being a lifting technician.
So let's take an example to maybe illustrate the broader point of lifting being a skill. We look at like, sports like tennis, golf, swimming. Like we're like so hyper focused on the technique of those things. If you're introduced, like you mentioned jujitsu earlier, I know a bunch of people who do jujitsu, and it's such a technical sport. Like you wouldn't believe how specific certain things need to be. And so what you do when you're introduced to jujitsu is like you're day one, like you're not going to go into the class and try to beat the shit out of other people and get the shit beat out of you. Like that's not how you learn technique. At least if you're operating with a good coach, you learn technique by learning, the very basic things, the principles around why you're doing certain moves. Like I don't really know anything about jiu-jitsu, but I do know that like it's a very technical thing, and people take it seriously because you're physically putting yourself in a very, I guess, precarious position, right? You're putting yourself in positions that like you could easily get hurt in. And so, we look at like technique and we take technique very seriously in those contexts. But for some reason, we walk into the gym and we're like, we're dealing with all these, very heavy loads relative to what our system has dealt with probably prior to taking lifting seriously. And all of a sudden now it's like we don't even, we look at a preacher curl and we think it's very simple. And in some ways it is as a skill. But we don't take it seriously because it looks simple. It's like, oh, people, forever have done this curling thing. So like, let me just go and do it. And so I think it's more of like a framing issue with lifting in particular, people not looking at individual exercises as skills. And what you notice in a lot of more advanced trainees, it's like a lot of advanced trainees, again, who, may or may not be taking copious amounts of drugs to support their muscle growth. They just treat exercise as like this sort of thing that they have to jump over to get to their goal, rather than these individual components that, if improved, are going to at least to some degree, make their results more effective, potentially, but more so than that, allow them in orthopedic health that long term, I think is much more sustainable, is much more appropriate for what you would consider a healthy body, to be like. So taking each individual motion sort of as its own thing, much like strength is its own thing. It's like each individual motion is its own sort of new, golf club swing, right? Obviously a golf club swing, lot more complex than doing a preacher curl, right? But if you don't take the preacher curl seriously and you're making content for YouTube, right, you may or may not, tear both your biceps trying to lift 135 pounds in a preacher curl, which I've seen like way more times than I'd like to admit. I think just viewing, these exercises through the lens of actually being each completely separate skills. Obviously, there's carryover in terms of like, if you take someone who's been lifting for a decade and you put them on a new exercise, it's much more likely that they're able to, find and feel what they need to at a much faster rate as someone who's never lifted before, obviously. But I, generally speaking, find that the people who take the skills the most seriously are never the people who are constantly in like a sort of injury bucket. And they're never people who are complaining about, oh, I have biceps tendonitis for XYZ reason. Right. So, taking lifting as a skill, I think is one of the more beneficial things from the perspective of like, if you could really, really dive into any single topic to improve your experience in the gym, it would be learning the skill of every lift, rather than all of the other, things that people seem to be hyper interested in at the moment. Like, even if you don't know the anatomy, right, just vaguely knowing the directions that you're trying to move, the positions that you're trying to get in, and those sorts of things, I think pays huge dividends for people that make the leap of not taking it seriously to taking it more seriously.
I think a lot of people look at the Olympic lifts because those are just so insanely complicated. And I feel like everyone, when you start getting into lifting, is like, oh yeah, I'm going to like do the Olympic lifts eventually, because like for power development or whatever. And, then you kind of realize, and this is something that I think you talk about a lot, where it's like basically you want to try to eliminate the skill component as much as possible to give an exercise, like using a preacher curl, using a bench. But there is always still a technical, a skill component to it. And the better you can get at these things, like neurologically, one might say. And that's why I think one of the benefits is you've talked a lot about not locking out in the bench press. I find myself and a lot of people, it's a lot harder for them to get back down in the same place. It's a lot more coordination required because the force, in my opinion, isn't putting them in that right direction.
Yeah. And I mean, like, to use that specific example, you also have other things to consider, like the amount of momentum that you're able to create, locking out to, just basically like the whole unlocking the elbows thing is something that can really make or break someone in that case, where like you go from the intent to lock to the intent to not lock, and you end up not only like is your arm path more specific to where you want it to be, but the amount of distance that you're moving is obviously shorter, right? So the amount of inertial effects that you have to overcome in the bottom position also tends to be lower. So it's interesting how like one, it could just be, it might not even be a cue, right? It might just be like, hey, don't do this or don't do that. And, understanding the context of the goal and the context of what you're actually, aiming for as far as the skill component goes can clear up so many other issues without actually having to individually go in, right? And sort of start to address those issues. But that's just one example of, a million different ones.
Yeah. And it's also easy to forget. And I forget myself sometimes. Like when I started lifting, I was just like so uncoordinated. It was so hard for me to do all these things. And now we're doing like these lengthened bicep curls and your upper arm isn't moving a centimeter. And it's like, I forgot how long it took me to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, that's where it's, I think, really, really helpful to know and dig into all the force stuff, is because if you are able to set people up for success from a force perspective, you don't really need to, give them all these things that they need to like mentally masturbate about to actually just accomplish the exercise correctly. Right. Like I have, I started training my cousin, I don't know how long ago now. We're coming in on like 100 sessions or so, but he had never lifted in his life. And he also wasn't someone who played sports. So he didn't have like a very good sense of how to move his body and stuff. And it's amazing to me how the brain will sort of just find the best solution based on the forces that it has to deal with, and how, he looks better lifting than 99% of people that I see come in the gym who have been lifting for years, right? Because he's just, and it sounds very like woo woo and like complicated, but it's really not. Like once you know just the basic things to look for in the different motions, so from a force perspective, which maybe I'm sure we'll get into at some point. But yeah, that's just the broad strokes, ideas that I have on that. I just think that like the skill components are probably much more important because everyone wants to just like use as much load as they can as immediately as they can, without realizing that the amount of load that they're using is directly dependent on the skill that they're performing. So it may look like someone is doing, a preacher curl, for example. And so maybe they'll grab like a 30 or a 40 and they'll be kind of heaving it. And then once you actually get them to use the weight that they're using, that load tends to drop. And it's like, if you have a client, you don't have to experience that whole ego, like that shot to their ego. If you just start with where they should be starting, right? As opposed to starting way ahead of where they're starting. And now all of a sudden they're discouraged. Why did I get weaker? And it's like, no. You're just like using the load that you should have used like 10 weeks ago, when you started this exercise.
That's a great point. That those times in your training period or training journey definitely hurt a bit when you're like, I'm actually gonna have to go back down to the 70s or whatever it is.
Yeah, but then you feel like your shoulders don't feel like you have crippling like inflammation all the time. When you're actually using your muscles. Like, who would have thought? Crazy notion.
Who would have thought? Yeah, no, it's definitely worth it long term. It just takes a little bit of swallowing your pride sometimes, but definitely.
Oh yeah, which is it's good for the soul.
For sure. So in a program, when do you switch up exercises? And I guess what's your approach? Not like literal definitive answer, but.
Yeah. So if we're talking about a setting that I can really have a lot of control over, like my own training, I will do it based on the rate of progression of the exercise and when that seems to completely stall out. And when that point comes, again, to some degree it's arbitrary, but I'll say, okay, 2 weeks where I haven't added load or I haven't added reps or I haven't improved or changed technique in some way. 2 weeks is usually the amount of time that I give for that to happen. But I will say that 100% of the time so far, and like my training career it's not like as long as, some people in the industry. Like I've only been weight training seriously since probably, 6 or 7 years now. I've been lifting for 10 years, but that was always for sport and that was total crap. So I don't consider that part of it. But in terms of just getting back on track, I lost my thought there.
2 weeks changing up the exercise.
Oh yeah. 2 weeks changing up exercise. I would say that like 99% of the time, no, actually 100% of the time in my experience, what happens is some other issue comes up that takes priority over me needing to switch the exercise, meaning that other things in my progression stall out before the actual exercise progression itself. So for me, oftentimes it's like, oh my God, I've worked myself up to 4,200 calories and I'm just like, I feel ready to explode every single day. I can't take it. Or, maybe just in general, I'm more irritable. Maybe my sleep is getting worse. Maybe my digestion is getting worse. Those are the sorts of things that stall me out first in a block. It usually doesn't happen to be the exercise progression. I think the reason that people often find that the exercise progression stalls is because they either start from a really bad place, like we were just talking about. Like they start the exercise using way more load with really shit technique, right? So the rate of progression and the potential timeline of that progression just shrinks to like a couple weeks. Or they're just their framework of progression is way too macro relative to the exercise, right? So like generally speaking, you're doing hack squats, you're using, at least a few plates on there. Hopefully, if you're a dude that's 200 pounds, you're using at least a plate. But, if you're not, no shame about that. Maybe the Cybex hack, it's pretty heavy, whatever. You have a huge loading potential, right? It's an exercise you can use a ton of absolute load on, right? So you can slip on a 2.5, right? And it's almost imperceivable adding the 2.5, but you add a 2.5 to, a 15-pound lateral raise, and that's all of a sudden it's a much, much higher percentage of the load that you were originally using. So people are like, oh, I can't progress from the 20s. I'm just jumping to the 25s. And it's like, bro, that's 25% of the load that you were just using. Your framework for progression in the exercise just needs to change. It's not that you've stalled out. It's just that you need to assume not even a different framework, right? Because on a percentage-based standpoint, like if you just think about it for half a second, it makes a lot of sense, right? You're not getting on the hack squat, adding 25% load week to week. So oftentimes that will clear things up. But in terms of the actual question of when do I switch exercises, I will alter the exercise that I'm doing if I do see that 2-week stall in myself or in a client. But I won't change the exercise so that it's unrecognizable. I usually just change a component of the same exercise. So if I'm doing a regular dumbbell bench press on a 30-degree incline, instead of, going to a machine chest press with a similar angle, I'll just use the same exercise, but I'll add in a pause at the bottom, or maybe I'll change the tempo, or maybe I'll change the rep range, right? I try to just move as much as I need to away from that to sort of reset the progression, but not so far that I need to now adapt to this entire new stimulus that I'm unfamiliar with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. That was my following question too. So you answered that. Cool. Yeah. I think it's a good way, and it's basically what you said, is like kind of viewing it as trying to increase the tension over time. So it's like adding in a pause where there's most tension, or maybe like, in terms of like the lateral raise example, switching to a cable lateral raise at some point, and then you can control more of the tension throughout the movement and divvy that up versus just having one point of maximal tension.
Yep. And sometimes, I won't necessarily view that as like progression regression. I think something that is often talked about is like, oh, if they're not, if this person can't execute a back squat correctly, then like go to a front squat. It's like, maybe not. Like maybe let's just change how we're setting up the back squat. Like we don't need to think about regression, progression. It's just a completely different skill set, right? That it's not even categorically similar at all. The forces are completely different between these two scenarios. So rather than saying, a cable versus a dumbbell lateral raise are completely, because they are similar in some ways, but I would say that like, if I were doing a dumbbell lateral raise and I wanted to make a change, maybe I use a little bit more momentum in the bottom, or maybe I pause at the top depending on what, goals are, or like I said, maybe I'll change rep range. But I try to, again, I think it's really important for people to try to actually standardize their training as much as possible. I think it's very, and some might argue that it's not necessary from a progression standpoint, from like a physique progression standpoint. And I absolutely think that's true. Like most bodybuilders just go in, they vaguely know what they're going to do, and they just like do 1,000 exercises that all are exactly the same, right, for that body part. And that works great, but like, that doesn't really work great for normal people who are trying to actually live, this other life. They have real jobs. They're like doing other things. So I think it's very easy to zoom in and assume that should be everyone. But when you zoom out, it's like, no, what we should look to do, and this kind of ties into one of the topics that you had on the list of like being emotional when you're training. I think that we should make training as low stress as humanly possible, so that we can maximize the recoverability and like live the rest of our lives normally. And part of making that environment lower stress, right? Obviously it's stressful inherently in many ways, but part of making that environment lower stress is just standardizing week to week exactly what you're doing. Because you start to realize that when you go from having everything very standardized for periods of time to having, even just independent variables just not standardized, it's absolute chaos from like a stress standpoint, because not only do you not really know what different things are doing if you're changing more than one thing, but you now also are piling these sort of layers on top of one another, where it's like, I have the stress of, my job, and now I'm changing this exercise, and I have to like figure out the load on this new exercise. Now I have more time in the gym, and not only do I have more time in the gym, but now I feel more fatigued for the next exercise. And right. So it's just like all these sort of compounding things that add up over time that people don't take seriously. And then they wonder like, why am I stalled out after like 4 weeks? I've only changed the exercise every single week. Like, why am I stalling? I don't know.
Yeah.
Sort of a thing.
Yeah, I think that's part of the beauty of like some of the N1 biomechanics stuff, having that lens where it's like you can go to a different gym and like have different equipment, but like be able to get the same thing done. And you're not. That's a great point about like kind of eliminating the chaos, because I have definitely been one of those guys that just puts on their like AC/DC or whatever for like a leg day, and then you are just amped up, and then you try and go back to work, and you're just like sitting there. There's no way. You're just like And you're right. There's definitely most people. I mean, we're a little bit nuts, but yeah, you're an emotionless training guy. So we can, for most people, that's just really not going to work. Just going from one end to the other, unless that is their absolute outlet.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. Like I have my fair share of days where I'm just like, I need to just like tear it up in there and just get angry and just use that emotion to my advantage, but it's very infrequent now. It's like I try to remain as calm as possible whenever possible.
I do it. I'll use it very targeted, I would say. But like, there's certain things that like, I mean, you're just exhausted after that. Like, have you ever, I mean, and that's why they say you can't fight angry, right? In MMA, it's like, cause they just gas themselves out.
Yeah. And that applies to, I mentioned some of my jujitsu buddies. They say the same thing. They're like the most advanced jujitsu trainees are the ones that are like, can basically just expend the least amount of energy with every single movement that they do. And so for some reason, again, this goes back to ultimately the bigger conversation of the skill thing. It's like, if you focus on the skill, then the emotional aspect of things actually it almost goes away, right? Because what people are doing most often to sort of fuel their focus is they're honing in on an emotion rather than just, am I accomplishing the objective goals that I have? And when you focus in on accomplishing the objective goals that you have with an exercise, all of the markers of fatigue that you would have experienced basically just diminish to zero, at least just transiently, right? Like in the session. And all of the other progressions that you had planned in that session are more easily targeted and made as a product of you just being less fatigued. Like, fatigue is useful in the context of like, I want to fatigue this muscle, but it's not useful in the context of like, I'm globally and systemically just beaten right now because I've used up all of my emotional stores to fuel this fucking arm day workout that took 45 minutes. It's like, no. Let's relax and let's just like take a step back and be mature about this. We don't need to lose our minds over a bicep session.
Yeah, you brought up the jiu-jitsu thing, and I think you can pretty reliably tell how advanced someone is in jiu-jitsu just by listening to them breathe during it. The advanced people, you just won't hear a single breath, which doesn't necessarily apply to exercise, because if you're not breathing during your hack squat, you're probably going to die. Yeah. But it is interesting. But that brings up a good point that I've been thinking about recently, and partially from you. How do you measure failure in yourself and others in a workout? So I know obviously so your rep speed tends to slow down. That's actually what I've been thinking about, like visually perceiving my rep speed. But how do you know that you're not cheating yourself out of more reps?
The biggest factor here, I would say, goes back to the standardization of the skill. So, for example, we'll take I use the lat pull down example, or whether it's single arm, double arm, doesn't matter. You're doing a lat pull down and you're doing it with a cable. From a profile standpoint, like regardless of what you do, you're probably not just going to randomly fail, in the top position, you're probably, even if you use a ton of momentum, you're probably going to not be able to get the bottom portion of the range, and you're always going to be able to do some partials toward the end. So what I like to standardize is I'll call failure within the context of that exercise whatever my goals are in terms of what I want, what portion of the range I want to make sure it has failed. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if I'm doing, again, a lat pull down, and my goals are just like, I want to get the most stimulus possible, the most mechanical tension, whatever you want to call it, out of this exercise. I just want to fuck up my lats and fuck up my upper back as much as possible. What I will make sure in the context of that goal is that I cannot move an inch out of the top portion of the range, right? But if my goals for that exercise are, let's say, like, I just want to train so that I fail in the short position and I don't get a full rep, but I can probably still bang out some partials. Maybe it's for recoverability purpose. Maybe it's just because, the exercise that I'm doing after that accomplishes the goal of training the more lengthened position in a different way, right? So all these things need to be contextualized, context dependent to the individual. But in the context of the situation where I'm just trying to fatigue the short position, I'll say, okay, now I've hit failure when I can no longer, I can still bang out maybe a couple partials at the top, 5, 6, maybe even depending on the profile, and just how angry I can get. But once I've fatigued the short position and I've accomplished that goal, now the set's over. So in one instance, it's like, okay, I called failure when I could no longer move an inch out of the top portion of the range. And in another instance, I called failure, I wasn't able to get a full rep. And those two things are very different to me. I don't think either one is better or worse, just in absolute. But I would say that as long as you've identified what specifically your goals are and where you want to fail according to those goals, then either one of those two things could be appropriate based on the context of the exercise.
And that's almost like, not exactly, but kind of like a RPE, like RIR kind of thing, right? Where it's different, but in the aspect of like, all right, I'm going to choose to fail with 1 rep left versus I'm going to choose to fail at a certain partial motion where I can only get so much. Just kind of, I guess the whole point behind the RIR is just like quantifying failure, which I guess is what you're getting at there.
And to be clear, this is always so difficult to parse out, I guess, in the context of like an online training setting specifically, because you're not watching the person, right? Obviously, most of it is like is retroactive, I guess would be the word, right? Where you're looking at videos of their sets and whatnot. And to be honest, the majority of the people, the layer before this conversation is like, can you get to a very fatigued state without just completely changing the exercise, mid-set, not like, oh, where exactly do we want to fail? We only get to this conversation if we're dealing with someone who's completely competent in those, prior categories. I would say that another big thing with that too, in relationship to, the failure, not failure thing, a lot of times what will happen is people will fail at a certain muscle length, right? So using the lat pull down, they'll fail toward the bottom. And this can be a very useful strategy, by the way, then they'll just change either the arm path of the motion or the tempo of the motion, right? So maybe they go from initiating in a controlled way to initiating with a ton of momentum out of the top, right? So now they're not actually doing the same exercise, right? They're doing a different exercise in some way through one of those changes in variables. But they've continued to work themselves into a greater state of fatigue. Whether or not that's appropriate, I think is totally, up to the context of the scenario. But 99% of the time, I tend to just put things in buckets. So I'll tend to just choose 2 different exercises rather than to try to mush everything into a single one, unless I'm short on time or a client is short on time or whatever else. So it's important, I think, to realize that when people say, oh, I'm going past failure, it's like, no, there's only one kind of failure that you just experienced. Now you're just doing a different thing. Right. Yeah. And again, whether that's good or bad, I would say is dependent on what you're actually
I think
doing.
That's a really cool point. And you brought that up. I forget which podcast it was, but it was something about how like an exercise is a different exercise when you have put on 30 pounds of muscle, right? Or even like when you add 5 pounds to your lift, like it is technically like the loading parameters are slightly different. Obviously it's marginal, and obviously we keep the same name for whatever reason, but yeah, it is like you can completely change an exercise by the intent or like how you're performing it. So that's a great point, like different types of failure. What is your approach to keeping like, so I had a client, you program them typical hypertrophy workout, and they're like, yeah, these workouts for me, I'm coming from the CrossFit. These are just kind of boring. What is the Ben Yanes approach
for people who are like hyperactive and need to feel like they're dead?
No, maybe more so just like, oh, I'm getting bored with these workouts, I want to change it up.
Okay, so that's tricky because well, I'll tell you what I used to do, because what I do now is I just don't work with those people.
I knew you were going to say
that. But what I used to do was because like ultimately people who are bored are people who just feel like they're not working that hard. And with people who feel like they're not working that hard, I find that the answer most times is just heart rate. Like, can they perceive that their heart is pounding out of their chest? And if they can, feel some of that, experience some of that, then like the workout in their mind was a success for some reason. So what I'll do in those situations is, if it's possible, I will make basically the entire workout a giant set. And people's heart rates just stay high doing that. So, and if not the entire workout, then specific segments of the workout. If not specific segments of the workout, then I'll utilize things like just basically what can give them more time. I don't want to say time under tension. What can give them more time exercising in the same time window, right? So rather than doing a pull down with 2 arms, I'm going to do a unilateral pull down, and I'm going to superset that with a press. So, I'll do my right arm where I'm pulling. I'll do the press, and then I'll do my left arm. And then there's no rest between any of the exercises. I have enough time between each of those to recover from a muscular, like a local standpoint, but not enough time to recover from like a respiratory, cardiovascular standpoint. So even if you could make the argument that like, oh, this workout isn't optimal because I didn't fucking rest 4 minutes between my sets so that my performance dropped by 5%. They're going to be working hard. It's probably more than likely that they're getting the stimulus that they need to if they're using any appreciable load. And despite the fact that they may experience more aerobic fatigue than like you maybe would want in a goal that was optimized for hypertrophy, they're still probably going to get plenty of effective stimulus doing that kind of style of training. So that's worked for me in the past in terms of my specific population. But like I said, I don't work with many of those kinds of people anymore, because it's just like there are too many people who don't really care what their training is like and just want the best result for me to be working. Yeah, too many meatheads for me to be like working with people who are picky about like those sorts of things, which is I think is a very important thing if you're a personal trainer and you like you putting food on your table depends on you accommodating for those kinds of things. I think it's perfectly reasonable. But if you are working with someone who is prioritizing muscle building as their goal, they need to understand that there are certain things that they're not going to enjoy about their training or their nutrition or whatever else that they're just going to have to suck up. Like no one ever, got to a highly elite level by just doing things that they were totally comfortable doing, including resting more, but not that that's, the best thing to do. Right? We've seen plenty of examples where it's not, but that would be my general approach to that.
And then I just wanted to ask you a selfish question. Will probably be a couple more of those. Do you have any practical insights like that big takeaways from working with clients, both remote and not remote?
So we'll start with remote. The first thing that I would say about any remote client is that the program that you write for them should immediately not be based on the optimal results, but rather the optimal level that they can adhere to. So so like an example, for instance, would be you have a client who is very ambitious about their goals, but based on your prior experience with them, maybe you don't have any prior experience, so you can't learn this until you have time with them. But maybe, based on, maybe a coach that they're coming from that has told you this, or that, again, you've accumulated time with them. So, a bunch of these people, they're very ambitious. They're like, this is the new me, this next block, like I'm going to really be on top of my nutrition, my sleep. I'm going to get in, I want to train 6 days a week. That they're going to fall short of that. A really, really good thing to do is to sort of undershoot, not only your expectations, but just make your expectations for that client more appropriate in the way that you program. So rather than writing for them, this optimal program that you think is going to be best from a results standpoint, you will alter the program in some ways, whether it just be like lowering total volume because that they're not going to be able to adhere to like 90-minute sessions 5 or 6 times a week, or whether it just be like you having a conversation with them and being upfront about like, hey, that's a great thing that we want to work to 6 days a week, but like based on your previous experience, like you only end up making to the gym 4 or 5 times. Let's start there and move forward from there. I think just finding the most realistic starting point oftentimes allows for people to actually just accumulate more wins over time, because those type of people I found get really, really, really discouraged and experience these emotional extremes based off of them not meeting their own expectations. So I think it's one thing to want the best for your client and want the best results, but it's another to understand that like people don't really know. Not only do people not know what they're capable of, but they also don't oftentimes really know what they want. So even if they think they want like to be in the gym 6 days a week and they want to measure all their food and they want to sleep 8 hours a night, it never ends up happening, right? And so just wherever you can be realistic and sort of beat them to their own sort of faults, I think that's maybe a skill that you hone over time, just given your experience with the same client over time. But that's one of the biggest things for me was online. Just initially, I was really, really set on like meeting them with their goals. And I still think that that's important, obviously, like, people getting to where they want to get to. But at the same time, you have to, in your own head, even if you don't necessarily even talk about it, you have to, in your own head, set the realistic expectations through the programming in a way, like I said, where, you may not even have to tell them what you're doing necessarily to account for those things. So that's one big thing from an online perspective. Another big thing is more from a selfish perspective on your end is not every client is going to be the client for you, and you are not going to be the coach for every single client. And I think that's something that a lot of people experience when they're starting out, is just getting emotionally attached to the idea that like you need to be the person to help this person. When in reality, it's like, we don't really think about that in any other, like if you're in a romantic relationship, right, and it's like you both end up just hating each other, like there's no reason to assume, no one sits in that scenario and is like, I'm just the worst person. I suck at life. I suck as a person. You just break up. You go and find another person. Another person will be the person for you in that scenario. So the same thing applies to online training, whether it be, you have a disconnect in the way that, you two are communicating, you're just not on the same wavelength. I made the decision very early on to avoid all political conversations with clients, just because, for the most part, unless they were like really well aligned with me, just because it just creates unnecessary stress, unnecessary, So I think that for the most part, just acknowledging that you're not going to be the coach for everyone. And that doesn't mean that you don't try with people that you're struggling with. It doesn't mean that you don't, see things through. But at the end of the day, just being able to move on and being able to sort of acknowledge that not everyone is going to be for you, and vice versa, is something that is going to be very important especially as you accumulate more clients and go through more failures as well as more successes. So that's in the online realm, what I would say.
Awesome.
In terms of the in-person stuff, in person, there are obviously there are a lot more variables to consider during the actual session. Like you're never really in a session with someone when you're coaching them, let's say on a monthly basis, but you're obviously spending a lot more time with the people in that 1 hour. Like they're 100% of your attention, within that hour or that 45 minutes, whatever it happens to be. From an in-person coaching perspective, I think there are two major things that personal trainers really need to focus on. The first, and this may not actually be the priority, but the first that comes to my mind is just learning and understanding all the basic force stuff, because coaching exercise, teaching exercise becomes just so, I can't even describe how much exponentially easier when you understand what just, basic forces, are and how they apply to the body in different scenarios and those sorts of things. But the second thing is just making, like, this may sound kind of silly, but making every session sort of a continuation of the prior session in terms of the conversations, the kinds of things that you're talking about. Like every session that I have with my in-person clients now feels like a continuation of the previous session, where it's like we're talking about things we were talking about last night. There's a sense of familiarity that's created through that. There are no sort of, even if there are times where like I hear people talk about how like there can be awkward silences where like there's just not much to talk about, like just sort of accepting the ebbs and flows of those sorts of things, I think comes over time with people who train more people in person. And, just like any other relationship, what you end up finding is that, the sessions don't, in the first 3 months compared to the next 3 months can be completely different in terms of like your rapport with the person. And so I just think that accepting the changes along, like what I was saying with, every session being a continuation, just accepting the sort of changing story that happens over time where, one person may want to just do the same things over and over and over again. And you only figure that out by just paying attention to what they're saying. And another person, may want a different thing every session. And that's a different conversation. But, to kind of summarize, I would say the basic force thing is super important from a technical perspective, but just being like a person and just having a conversation with them is the most important thing probably of all, where certain people like, and especially just knowing just vaguely who you are and who a lot of people in this sort of niche are to a very generalized degree. We always want to like make the session optimal and assure them that, they're getting all the things that they need to get to make progress. But most people just like are happy with a really strong human connection. And for me, that takes a lot of like just sort of ego swallowing, where it's like, I'm now no longer dealing with someone who, wants to know about the intricacies of the biomechanics and how we should manage volume. I'm just dealing with a person that wants to talk to me, about The Last of Us and like what happened in the last episode, and just sort of
pretty good.
Accept, which is pretty good. I agree. No spoilers though for the people listening. But yeah, all very general and sort of non-directional there, but those are just the sorts of things that popped into my mind.
No, that was awesome. I think one of the big things I've had so far is just like, I'd assume you're probably similar, where it's just like kind of you're robotic with your training a little bit. Just like I'm going to put down pen and paper, and obviously like it's going to get done. Maybe, you feel horrible one day and your knee is wonky or whatnot, and you're just like, all right, I can't do this last set or whatever. But like generally the pen and paper get written down and checked off those boxes versus these people that are just, they're people, less robotic.
Yeah. And that's kind of where I think the whole human connection thing plays into it. Cause, someone, at least in-person training for me, like I would say, all my clients now, they're coming to do training sessions because of Ben, the person, and not really Ben, the trainer. And I think initially people come to meet the trainer, and eventually they come for the person. And if you can't make that transition between trainer to person, then people say things like they're getting bored, or they're not seeing results. But if they really connect with you on a personal level, that just like never happens, even if they're not getting results. It's like, if they do bring it up in a way where they're like, trying to express that they're not getting results, it's never like, I'm bored, I'm frustrated. It's like, hey, I've noticed that like our progress has slowed down. Like how can we make this a human conversation instead of like, trainer to client? It just becomes person to person.
Have you ever seen that like a doctor is much more likely to get sued based on how much the patient likes or does not like him? So like
I haven't. That's interesting.
We could, let's say I'm the anesthesiologist and you're like the orthopedist. You could do a horrible job, but you were the boy, and they'll want to sue me because they didn't like me, which is kind of it's interesting. But that's exactly what you were saying. Yeah,
and I think that applies to the online setting as well. People just feel like they have a rapport with you. It's like they'll stay with you forever, and they'll be upset when you leave.
Back to the meathead stuff. Sorry to detransition. What do you think? So this is something I've done a very poor job of myself. I've kind of just done like very aggressive bulks where I should have just, done it much more gradually. But something I've been reconsidering, and I'm currently bulked up a little bit, but something I've been reconsidering a little bit is the perma bulk the way, where it's just like, we have such a small capacity, minus the use of pharmacology, such a small capacity to put on muscle, especially after our first year. Like, should you just be trying to really like maybe put on a pound a month, or like even potentially less than that, where it's just like you were really trying to like almost just gradually gain muscle without really needing to go these cut and bulking cycles? What are your thoughts on that?
So I mentioned my training partner earlier, and he and I have talked a lot about this. He has a lot of really, really good thoughts. So just disclaimer, a lot of this comes from him, being, I think he wakes up in the morning at like 290 now or something. So needless to say, he's gone through the perma bulk,
one or two.
The perma bulk. Yeah. So I think the answer to this in terms of, what works for people is much more psychological to me. And you could make the argument like psychology is physiology, blah, blah, blah. We all know that one. But from the perspective of what actually works, both work, but meaning like when I say both, I mean, do we go through like the major bulks and the major cuts, or do we just go pound per month, like, for the next 10 years? Both work, but one of them makes you feel like you're doing a lot more than you actually are. Right. So you know what I mean? So like the and it's like crazy to me because I see this a lot with, we'll call them like influencers who, post like half naked pictures every day, which is like, more power to you. Go ahead. They'll be like, one week they'll be like, I'm on my 10th week of my bulk. And the next week they talk about how they're 2 weeks into the cut. I'm like, how does it mathematically, this doesn't even make sense. But it seems like someone's talking about a bulk and a cut like every other fucking week. And I'm like, this is just silly, right? These adaptations, like biological adaptations for the most part, are just like really, really slow, really, really long-term. You can't really perceive them. So, and the same holds true for hypertrophy in most cases. But this is only really a problem in naturals, right? Because people who are taking drugs just eat as much food as they need to or can, take the drugs, don't gain the fat, just gain the muscle, whatever, for the most part. Unless you're like really stupid. But even if you're really stupid, a lot of people end up, having that success anyway. They just take enough. But in the context of the natural lifter, again, both of those things I think work equally well. But the 8-week bulk, the 2-week maintenance, the 8-week bulk, the 4-week cut, like all that stuff, to me, it's valid from the perspective of it is psychologically motivating. It is good to have a new goal if you can adhere to it, if you can feel like you're moving in a direction. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that, like, for most naturals, like you mentioned, like maybe not after a year. Like after a year, it's like if your training is absolutely perfect and like you have everything dialed in, yeah, that makes sense. But like usually it's like a window of 2 or 3 years where people make the bulk of their initial progress, regardless of what they do. And then it's just like inch by inch by inch by inch, as long as they're super consistent over time. And so if, that's a tool that you feel is useful for you, like these really big bulks and these really big cuts, then more power to you. But it is by no means a necessary strategy. And what you often find is that with people who are more advanced, like someone like Alberto Nunez comes to mind. Alberto, like obviously genetic exception in many ways, but he's not like, he doesn't go from like looking like he's 300 pounds to looking like he's 150. He like just sort of fluctuates in this range that he knows is really comfortable for him. And although, yeah, like visually he may look a bit bulkier and he may look a bit more lean, he's found this sweet spot where he knows like, okay, over this period of time, I'm going to gain this amount of muscle. It's an infinitesimal amount of muscle. And so he doesn't go through these big sort of deviations from a center point, because he knows it's probably not going to be any more useful than just, again, as you mentioned, these very, very small changes to account for that. So, that's where my head goes. I think it's mostly a psychological thing, but it's by no means necessary in my experience.
It's almost kind of like throwing on a like psychological charade. So it's like we have these such at some point, right? Such infinitesimally small changes that are happening year over year or like month to month. So it's like we're gonna instead do the, and like I think also like there's probably consequences in terms of doing these cuts, because we know you're going to lose some muscle mass. How much it is like is debatable. We don't really know, but like probably typically maybe more optimal just lose as little fat as possible. But like back to that point where it's like we're going to use this, like do this huge cut in bulk. So we're like feel like we're doing something, as you pretty know what we're saying, and because we're not really going to see these huge changes, but we're going to make these huge changes by other means.
Yeah, and to me, it just creates more stress in the system most of the time.
Yeah.
So even if it is motivating, you don't often end up seeing people who are very advanced doing that.
No.
And I think that's telling to some degree. Not that like we should all just go and copy what the really advanced, genetically gifted are doing, but there is something to be said about, higher level bodybuilding. Like look at Eric Helms. Eric Helms has not that he's, I don't know if he's retired or not now, but he, much like Alberto, just like he always looks good year round because he's not getting super fat and super chunky. And, oftentimes too, it's interesting. You see a lot of these people who do these big bulks and these big cuts, and they look the same like pre and post. And it's like, oh, this was half of a year of progress and you look the same. Mm-hmm. So did you need to, eat in a 500 calorie surplus for 4 months, or could you have just maybe eaten in like an 100 calorie surplus, for that amount of time and seen literally exact changes or better changes, but just with much less noise sort of along the way.
It's interesting. I like the first time I got really lean. I was onto like Keno Body, if you know, like Grego Gallagher. And I never didn't put on any muscle, probably because I was trying to be ripped all the time, almost definitely. Mm-hmm. And then I started pledging a fraternity and got really fat and stress eating. I lost like 10 pounds for like 2 weeks. And I was like, dude, I'm going to be like 110 pounds soaking wet. I'm like 6 foot. So I just started like shoving, and I ended up like 190 and wasn't lifting it this time because like, you're pledging. But that was like one of the best things for me in terms of like mentally, because I was afraid to gain weight. But it's interesting. Mm-hmm. It's like you probably like, I don't know. And I thought like, it's so interesting like looking back now and hearing like what you're saying. It's like you really don't need to be doing any of these like huge fluctuations. Like it's really just kind of like putting your pedal to the floor and just kind of grinding progressively over time. Yeah.
And I mean, just to think about it, just to kind of like, I don't know what the term is, put a cap on this bottle. I would say that you need to create from a relative standpoint, you need to create the amount of stress on the system, and you need to supply the system with enough supply that is appropriate for that stress and that ability to change and that adaptation. So if the adaptation is this big, the amount of supply that you need will not be that much bigger in terms of the change that you're trying to impose. So most naturals, like, go ahead, eat like a slob the first couple of years that you lift. Everyone kind of probably needs to go through that at some point to actually learn that it's not the best thing to do.
Yeah.
And then after that point, I think, like I said, just with age, people tend to figure that out just sort of on their own.
Great points. Have you ever seen that study you brought up, like steroids, where it's like I think one of the ways they found out that like testosterone is inherently a nutrient partitioning hormone is this study where they basically like administered steroids to someone's just sitting on the couch and compared it to someone lifting. You ever seen that?
Yep.
That's pretty wild. Basically for the listeners, you can basically sit on the couch and not do anything and take steroids and you will gain more muscle mass than the natural person in the gym, at least to a degree, which is pretty crazy. What is your general nutrition advice? Just like where do you land for most clients or yourself?
Yeah. So, I mean, much like the mechanical tension thing, not my wheelhouse, just as kind of a disclaimer here. So, take this with a grain of salt. But I think that the way that I look at nutrition is just through as simplified as a lens as possible. If you or anyone listening has heard of Broderick Chavez, who's just a brilliant guy, he has this thing that he does where he will write ebooks on like sticky notes. And he has a book or an ebook called Sticky Note Nutrition or Sticky Note Hypertrophy, or I think those are both separate things, but he basically writes nutrition guidelines on a sticky note. And those are basically the guidelines that I've followed for a long time now. And I've, over the last, I want to say year or two, I put on like an appreciable amount of muscle, just sort of following these guidelines. I generally just go with the recommended gram per pound of protein. I basically fill in the amount of fat that I need based off of whatever protein that I'm eating. Like, it sort of comes along for the ride. Like, unless you're only eating chicken, and 99% fat-free chicken, like, I eat like 93.7 beef. Mm-hmm. So basically if I eat 8 ounces of beef, it's around 50 grams of protein, 10 grams of fat. And the fat numbers combined with the eggs and stuff that I eat just end up like working themselves out. And then I just fill the rest of my calories with carbs if I happen to be tracking. I haven't really been tracking the last couple of months. I've just taken a break from that because I went through a period of time where I was really, really dialed in, got exhausted, didn't want to do it anymore. But now basically what I do is I just make sure that like half of my plate is protein and the rest is some kind of, either carbohydrate or fat added if I don't already have fat in the meal. So, but from a direct advice standpoint, my most direct advice would be to pick as few foods as you are comfortable with picking, and then just sticking to the foods that you've picked.
Yeah,
and that will not work for a lot of people. But if someone's listening to this podcast, it'll probably work for them. If I had to list my foods very briefly: chicken, ground beef, steak, eggs, cheddar cheese, rice, potato, and then some kind of frozen vegetable mix. And like, that's basically it, plus protein powder, right? If that's in the mix. But you really can't go wrong if you pick like a limited amount of foods that are like
whole foods.
Whole foods, yeah, and just like sticking to the whole foods. Even if you're just eating intuitively, like, it's very rare that someone eats a large amount of those foods and just all of a sudden, becomes fat. Like, you just don't see that happen. Oh yeah, and fruits. Like, I don't put a cap on my fruit intake. Like banana, pineapple, apple, orange juice. So just the very basic things. I don't put a limitation on it. If I'm going to measure something in a sort of non-measuring phase, it'll just be protein, and that'll be it.
I see you following Carnivore Rally. So I know you're getting on the right wave. So
yeah, I try not to get too invested in that stuff because I know that there are a lot of nuances to the research that people like that cite that are just completely, like the whole seed oils thing. Like, I can't really speak to that, but that seems like a really hot topic in the nutrition realm. Another part of my advice would be to stay away from trying to interpret studies if you are not someone who is very specialized in, not someone who, because like I'm not a technical specialist in biomechanics. Like, I don't have a PhD or anything. but I know a lot more than the average person about biomechanics, and I just read very specific studies that are appropriate to me, and I let I let the sort of certified experts work out what is appropriate to work out for the lay person and to summarize for the lay person. I generally trust experts. I'm not one of those expert haters. But in the nutrition realm, there's just so much bullshit, it seems, on social media, that I tend to just stick with the people that are most in tune with a majority of the research, as opposed to this one study that's at this one thing in this one population of things that were not even human.
100%. Speaking of, how do you go about trying to, when you do interpret research, what do you find are the biggest mistakes you see being made for hypertrophy more so, I guess, in general though? And what would you like to see some pitfalls in the hypertrophy bodybuilding research that you would like to see corrected?
So, the biggest thing is just how people are doing exercises, right? Because the way that people do exercises, we'll take the example of the tricep study that came out however long ago that compared, it wasn't the one that compared overhead extension to neutral extension. It was some other one that was setting up the overhead extension in a plane that didn't make any sense for what you would want to see in terms of stretching the long head of the triceps. But regardless of maybe a specific example, it would make more sense to just say, I know that if most personal trainers and people who should know what sorts of things are more biomechanically correct than others, I know if those people don't really know what the fuck they're doing and they're investing a lot of time in trying to figure it out, that people who are specialized in research and conducting research and interpreting research are sure as hell not in that camp. At least based on what I've seen so far, there are some, examples where studies will show pictures of certain setups, and I'm like, the setup makes no sense for what they're describing as the goal. And then of course the results show that this thing that has a name didn't do what people usually thinks it do, and then it does, and then you look at the study and it makes perfect sense why it didn't do the thing that you thought it would do. So that's the number one thing. It's just that I would like to see improve from a research perspective, is just getting more people involved in the research that specialize in the mechanics of more these things, which is more meathead. Well, it's just very difficult to do, right?
Yeah.
Finding those people and then combining them. Yeah. But I think more important than that, from a general, the average person consuming this content, the thing that I would like to see more well understood is probably just that there's no single study that, outside of a few exceptions, should really completely alter your framework of a specific muscle group or a specific exercise. There should be no single study that comes out that just completely just blows up your entire, principle-based approach. If it does, and if it now all of a sudden changes everything that you're doing because this one study said this one thing, then you probably weren't following anything that was principle-based in the first place, right? That's not how that works. So just this general assumption that a research paper is science, rather than science being the process of interpreting research and interpreting all different kinds of research to sort of formulate a principle-based approach. I think that is the biggest problem with people making these infographics about this study showed this thing, and then people taking that out of context of who the study was done on, how many people was it done on, what were they actually doing in the study. No one really, myself included, is particularly competent on a very general level and being able to actually interpret what the people were interpreting and why. And so if I'm not able to do that, and I'm someone who reads research very frequently every single week, then the average person scrolling on social media is certainly not equipped to do that as well. Yeah. So just this distinction between what science actually is and what people think it is. being the kind of take home point here. Science is a process. It's not a thing. So when you say that this is a science-based workout, I know that you don't know what like science is and what it's for, because there's no such thing like that to me, that statement, like evidence-based this, evidence-based that, it's paradoxical, right? In that what you're doing is you're making a conclusion and you're saying this thing over here is the science, rather than saying science is this really complicated process that just is constantly evolving and changing based on new findings. Whether or not you're doing that intentionally, I think is irrelevant. I think in either case, it's
happening.
It's happening, and it's not a thing that is influencing people, I think, in an appropriate way.
It's very tough too, because it's like I encourage you to go and read the research. There's no harm in that. You're just going to educate yourself to anyone, but at the same time, it's like you hear. So I'll listen to like some experts. I think Chris Masterjohn's one of my favorite people in the nutritional sphere right now. And you hear him talking about the way he interprets this. And because he has this huge background, right, he's going to take different findings out of even their data than the actual scientists themselves that were conducting the studies. We're all people. We're all going to have our own biases and errors and things like that.
I was having this discussion recently with someone that the way that people will say influencers on social media, and I'm sure I've fallen for this trap plenty of times, without knowing it, but I'm trying to become more aware of it. I think people on social media communicate things in a very certain way. So they'll say, oh, this is what the current body says. And they'll say, okay, now that we know that the current body says this, do this, this, and this. If you ever hear a real researcher, a real scientist talk about literature, there's literally there's context given. Not only is there context given to every statement that they make, but along with every statement that they make, there's this underlying either implicit notion or explicit notion of their uncertainty and relationship to the claims. So it's like, we think that these things are trending in this direction, but more research is required. Or, this study showed this thing, but it had XYZ flaws that don't apply to this other scenario. So don't take this as gospel. Whereas people on social media and those sorts of things will be like, oh, this study said this thing, so go do this thing, devoid of the context of what the actual study is, or who it applied to, or who it didn't apply to, and all those sorts of things.
Just like as it gets further dumbed down, it just loses all the nuance and all of the speculations, just becomes like black and white, I guess. But so last question, a little bit more philosophical for you. How do you go about the learning and how do you go about the learning process?
Yeah, so I originally encountered this question indirectly when people would ask where that they should start learning more about biomechanics and anatomy. That's probably the most common question that I've gotten in my time, just posting content and getting questions from people. And so I did make an ebook to sort of vaguely answer that question. Like that was the inspiration for making the first ebook that I wrote. But what I always had said before that, in terms of, and I'll still give this advice, is just just create movement and just create, just like you would in training. It's like, if you're completely unmotivated to train, just create some sort of movement and something will happen. And so in terms of learning and knowledge, I don't see it any differently psychologically, physiologically. It's like, just create some sort of movement in your learning to start to move you in a direction, because people are just so worried about even in the specific realm of where do I start with biomechanics? I could give you 10 different recommendations for 10 different books, and you might not connect with any single one of them because you actually have no idea what you're interested in within the topic.
Yeah.
So the first question I ask to people who ask that question of where do I start or how do I go about a learning process, I just tell people to follow what they're interested in. So if the general interest is biomechanics, anatomy, exercise mechanics, I'll be like, well, what are you interested in learning about? Why are you interested in learning about it? Do you want to grow big biceps? And people are usually like, yeah, I want to grow big biceps. So I'm like, okay, just Google biceps and start learning about biceps. And what you find, and it seems kind of silly and overly simplistic, but what people find is that biceps takes them to the shoulder joint. The shoulder joint takes them to the scapula. The scapula takes them to the rear delt because it's on the scapula. The rear delt takes them, right? So it's just this process of just moving from thing to thing. And eventually, you take a step back from all of the movement that you've created. And all of a sudden now you have this big picture that you didn't even realize was underneath of the surface because of all of the different sort of routes that you took. So there's no place to learn. There's no book to learn. There's no path to take. It's just create movement, and you will end up at a place where, again, if you're actually interested in the broad scope topic, you'll just end up just figuring out so many different things that you maybe weren't even aware of that you knew. And, someone asks you a question, you're like, oh shit, I read about that like 3 weeks ago. And I like totally forgot that I read it. I don't even know how I ended up there, but like now it's in my brain and now I have this more complete picture as a product. So it's totally arbitrary path, just as I think everything really is. Like people operate under this assumption that they're actually in control of like, their path to some degree. And I don't really subscribe to that. I just kind of am like, what am I interested in right now? I'm just going to go do that thing and just kind of see where I bounce around to.
I'm going to disagree with you there. I think you should all go check out Ben's ebooks. I'll give you a shout out there. Really high quality. Ben is one of my favorite people in the fitness industry. I go to him for a lot of my fitness stuff. But yeah, definitely. And I'll give you a chance to shout yourself out in a sec. I just wanted to ask one last question. And I also really like the year, you're taking the ideas like bouncing around. I think sometimes people try to go like an inch wide and a mile deep. And I don't think that's, for 99% of people, I don't think that's the best approach. I think it's better to kind of, bounce around, see where your interest goes. Yeah. And a lot of times you'll be able to integrate these webs. But the last question, getting a bit philosophical for you. And I'll give you two ways you can interpret this. So what would be your best advice to give yourself when you were getting into the sport or starting lifting? And I'll give you the caveat that, like, for me, I would obviously say, like, how would you give a cop-out answer? Like, I wouldn't tell myself anything because, I'm glad where I ended up here. but let's say, like, maybe you wanted to give yourself younger Ben Meathead some advice, or just like a random stranger that's coming to you. Maybe your son. Or your cousin.
So just a question to clarify. Are we talking about like lifting or like the social media stuff?
Let's do lifting.
It's so hard to come up with a straight answer, because I am so happy with where, I went with it. I would say that the thing that I not necessarily regret most, because again, those aforementioned aspects of it, the thing that I think that I would have liked to know sooner is that everyone is just winging it. Because there were a lot of people very early on in my lifting career. So it's not even necessarily related directly to like, hey, do this thing on this exercise. It's more like broad scopes. Understand that everyone that you put on a pedestal is just a person. And there are so many things that person is completely and utterly confused about, and they will always be completely confused about those things. And that you should really, really, really try to take everyone or understand all the information that people put out in that context. That was really a wake up moment for me. Just not a single moment, but many moments along the course here where, 6 years ago, I would have thought this one person was an intellectual god. And now I look at their content and what they're saying, and I'm like, this person really has no idea what the fuck they're talking about. I wish that I could have had that perspective sooner, because I think I went down a lot of unnecessary rabbit holes, which again, the caveat of like happy where I am, that kind of thing. But I think that, just younger Ben would have appreciated knowing that everyone is pretty much full of shit, to some degree, especially if they're talking about like more than one single thing. So that would be it. Yeah. That's an answer I actually haven't thought of before in my own thinking. So I appreciate the task to, come up with that answer.
No, that was great on the spot too. Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for hopping on, Ben. I would love to have you back on at another point. Where can everyone find you?
Just my name on Instagram. And Yeah,
Giannis.
everything is Giannis. Yeah, don't even try to just look at the podcast title and just type it in. You know, it'll come up. My weird face that I make with my profile picture.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's a pleasure, Tyler. Great chat. Time flew by, so I'd love to come back on.
I hope you guys really enjoyed that podcast. Ben is really knowledgeable about everything biomechanics and fitness. And as I said, he's one of the people that I really rely on and go to for all of my updates within the fitness industry. So definitely go check him out. And I really hope you guys all enjoyed this. Till next time, guys, be good.